Walk through Bedminster now, and the brick still looks certain of itself. It still rises like industry never left. But the whistles are gone. The shifts are gone. The smell of leaf is gone. In their place, apartments, polished lobbies, and heritage sold back as lifestyle. That is what makes the Wills story so unsettling. This was not a minor factory. It was one of the great engines of Bristol, a tobacco empire that fed families, shaped whole districts, funded landmarks, and helped teach Britain how to smoke. Then it was taken apart piece by piece, not by fire or war, but by evidence, tax policy, corporate strategy, and men who could defend every decision while erasing an entire world. This is the story of how Wills built an empire, how that empire remade a city, and how, when the work disappeared, the buildings were left to remember what Britain chose to forget. The story begins in 1786, which is to say it begins before cigarettes, before mass advertising, before sponsorship deals, before coupons, before factory clocks, and before anyone in Bristol could have imagined tobacco becoming the defining industry of South Bristol. It begins with a young man from Salisbury named Henry Overton Wills. He was not born to aristocracy. He was not the heir to an old merchant dynasty. His father was a clockmaker. The family belonged to the world of English dissenting Protestantism. Disciplined, practical, industrious. The kind of people for whom work was not merely economic but moral. In that world, success was something to be justified by conduct. Wealth, if it came, was to be earned, managed soberly, and ideally returned in part to the community. Henry Overton Wills arrived in Bristol at a moment when the city already had tobacco in its bones. For generations, Bristol had handled tobacco leaf coming from North America. The city's prosperity had long been entangled with Atlantic trade, and that trade included goods produced through slavery. By the time Wills arrived, tobacco was already part of Bristol's commercial metabolism. Shops sold snuff and pipe tobacco. Mills processed leaf. Merchants moved it through the port. Workshops gave it form. The city understood the commodity. It had not yet seen what mechanized cigarette manufacture would turn it into. Henry entered that older world first. He went into partnership with Samuel Watkins, opening a small tobacconist business on Castle Street. The scale was modest. Snuff, pipe tobacco, retail trade. The sort of establishment that would have looked entirely ordinary among Bristol's commercial streets. There was nothing in the premises themselves that hinted at an industrial empire. But the business moved, expanded, and changed names as partnerships shifted. Watkins retired. Henry continued. He merged with Peter Lilly, gained access to milling, and gradually anchored the firm more firmly in production as well as sale. It was not a dramatic rise. It was incremental. One of the reasons the Wills story later feels so large is that it began so untheatrically. No single leap. No genius investor arriving with a fortune. Just a chain of sensible decisions made over years by a man who understood that durable businesses are often built by repetition before they are built by spectacle. He married Anne Day, daughter of a Bristol draper. Their son was named William Day Wills, a small family detail that would become one of the most familiar sets of initials in British commercial life. The company that later became W.D. and H.O. Wills literally carried the family inside its name. When Henry died in 1826, the business passed to his sons William Day Wills and Henry Overton Wills II. And here one of the most revealing facts about the company appears. Neither man was a smoker. The product that would make the family famous was not, for them, an enthusiasm. This was not a romance of tobacco. It was something older and more Protestant than romance. Commerce, discipline, method, reputation. That distinction matters, because it shaped the kind of empire Wills became. The family did not build its identity around flamboyance. It built it around seriousness. It mattered that the firm was regarded as fair. It mattered that workers were treated, by the standards of the day, decently. It mattered that profits were connected, at least in the family's own imagination, to duty. The Wills mythology did not say, "We love tobacco." It said, "We are responsible stewards of a great enterprise." But even in the beginning, there was a contradiction running underneath the respectability. Bristol's tobacco wealth did not begin in a moral vacuum. The leaf itself came through an Atlantic system shaped by unfree labor. The Wills family were not slave traders, and official University of Bristol history distinguishes carefully between that and the ways they nonetheless benefited from slavery through the tobacco economy. That distinction is important. So is the fact that the wealth was still connected to slave-grown tobacco. The civic philanthropy came later. The raw material came first. By the middle decades of the 19th century, the firm was growing steadily. It absorbed experience, family, and rivals. It developed the habits that later became legend: careful expansion, close family control, and a paternal relationship with employees that could feel generous from one angle and controlling from another. The business was becoming large. But it was not yet the machine that would dominate Britain. That transformation required two things: a new product and a new technology. For much of the 19th century, tobacco in Britain still belonged to older forms: snuff, cigars, pipe mixtures. Cigarettes existed, but they had not yet become the everyday democratic object they would become by the end of the century. They were slower to make and, therefore, relatively more limited in scale. Mass consumption needed mass production. That was what the Bonsack machine promised. In 1883, members of the Wills family saw the future and, crucially, understood it faster than their rivals. The Bonsack cigarette-making machine, invented in the United States, could produce cigarettes at a speed that handrollers could not remotely match. It represented more than a productivity gain. It represented a transfer of the cigarette from skilled manual object to industrial output. Once that happened, price, volume, and distribution could all change at once. Wills did not merely buy the machine. It secured exclusive British rights to the process. That was the masterstroke. Plenty of businessmen adopt a technology. Fewer understand that the real profit lies in denying it to everyone else. The result was immediate. Wills became the first British company to mass-produce cigarettes on a transformative scale. Output surged. Costs fell. Competition found itself trying to fight an enemy that had already moved onto another level of industrial warfare. British tobacco had been reorganized around the machine, and Wills was holding the controls. Then came the product that converted industrial advantage into cultural dominance: Woodbine. Launched in the late 19th century as a cheap, accessible cigarette, Woodbine was priced for workers rather than elites. This was essential. Wills did not simply mechanize production, it democratized smoking. The cigarette ceased to be a limited item and became an everyday companion to labor, routine, and male working-class life. Sold cheaply, known instantly, and distributed widely, Woodbine became one of the defining objects of British popular culture. Other brands followed: Gold Flake, Capstan, Three Castles, Passing Clouds. But Woodbine captured something larger than brand share. It entered the national vocabulary. It was bought at corner shops, smoked in shipyards, carried by soldiers, and woven into the speech and memory of 20th century Britain. Wills had not only built a successful line, it had found the perfect industrial-age cigarette: inexpensive, recognizable, and available everywhere. Production required new space, and in 1886 Wills opened its great Bedminster factory on East Street. This was not just a manufacturing site. It was an announcement. The building was ambitious, electrically lit, modern, and architecturally self-conscious. It treated a tobacco factory as a civic monument. That choice tells you something about Wills. The company wanted scale, but it also wanted legitimacy. It wanted the factory to say not merely that goods were made here, but that a serious and permanent institution had taken root. And then the permanent institution began expanding almost immediately. The Bedminster works grew because demand grew. Cigarettes were no longer marginal. They were becoming one of the defining habits of industrial Britain. Wills was perfectly positioned to ride that habit upward. It had the machine advantage, the product range, the capital, and the organizational discipline. The cigarette, in its cheap machine-made form, was one of the great consumable commodities of modern Britain, and Wills reached it early enough to shape the market instead of merely join it. There is a temptation, looking back, to imagine inevitability. That once the machine arrived, success simply followed. But that is not how industrial history works. Technologies arrive all the time. Empires are made by those who grasp what a technology allows culturally, not only mechanically. Wills understood that cigarettes were not just faster to produce. They were easier to turn into habit, easier to price for the masses, easier to package, easier to advertise, easier to make part of everyday routine. The machine gave Wills speed. The brands gave it meaning. The factory gave it physical force. Together they turned a Bristol family firm into the first great British cigarette empire. And by the turn of the century, that empire was large enough to attract the attention of America. If stories like this matter to you, subscribe. There are more vanished factories, more forgotten empires, and more places still living inside what industry left behind. Because empires like this rarely rise without eventually drawing a challenger. And when that challenge came, it came from the most aggressive tobacco power in the world. In 1901, James Buchanan Duke came to Britain representing the aggressive confidence of American tobacco capitalism. Duke had helped build the American Tobacco Company into a near monopoly in the United States. He understood scale, price wars, and intimidation. He assumed that what had worked in America would work in Britain. Buy in, undercut the market, force the locals into submission, then absorb what remains. It was a reasonable assumption, if you did not understand the structure of British tobacco or the particular position of Wills within it. What Duke encountered was not one weak firm waiting to be picked off, but an industry capable, under pressure, of consolidation. The response was historic. In December 1901, 13 British tobacco firms combined to form the Imperial Tobacco Company of Great Britain and Ireland. Wills was central to this merger. Not peripheral. Central. It was the senior force within the new combine, and Wills' family influence ran through the resulting board and leadership. The merger was one of the great moments in British corporate history. On one level, it was defensive, a coalition formed to repel an American threat. On another level, it was opportunistic, a chance to turn an industry-wide crisis into a domestic giant. Duke had intended to conquer British tobacco. Instead, he helped produce one of the largest companies in the world. The eventual settlement in 1902 created British American Tobacco as a joint venture and effectively divided markets. Domestic territories would be respected. Export markets would be pursued in common. Imperial would dominate at home. BAT would range abroad. It was a remarkably elegant corporate peace after an attempted commercial invasion. For Wills, the outcome was extraordinary. The company moved from being a dominant family firm to sitting at the heart of an even larger industrial organism. and because it entered that new company with weight, money, plant, and influence, it did not disappear into imperial. It shaped imperial. This matters because it explains the scale of what followed. Imperial's command of the British tobacco market became immense. Wills, as one of its core engines, now stood at the center of a national business whose revenues, employment, and political access made it something more than an ordinary manufacturer. Tobacco was not just a private trade. It was tied to tax, to empire, to retail distribution, to war supply, to public revenue, to consumption at a mass scale. Wills sat where all of that met. And with scale came philanthropy on a similarly grand scale. The Wills family gave Bristol institutions that still define the city's image. Henry Overton Wills III's gift of £100,000 in 1908 was crucial to securing the University of Bristol's charter. The family's gifts to the university over subsequent decades became enormous. University of Bristol records place known donations between 1909 and 1957 at more than £1.37 million, excluding important gifts of land and property. The Wills Memorial Building, funded by George Alfred Wills and Henry Herbert Wills in memory of their father, became perhaps the most conspicuous expression of tobacco wealth in stone. That building matters beyond architecture. It tells you how the family wanted its wealth remembered, not only as private fortune, but as public inheritance. The museum, university buildings, churches, hospitals, charities. The Wills story was written into Bristol's institutions. None of this cancels the contradictions. The money was still tobacco money. The tobacco economy was still linked, historically, to an Atlantic world shaped by slavery and then, later, to a product increasingly associated with mass illness. But contradiction is exactly what makes the Wills story so enduring. The family could be paternal, civic-minded, and genuinely philanthropic, while still standing atop an industry whose commodity would eventually kill millions. By the 1920s and 1930s, Imperial was among the largest industrial concerns in the world. Wills had done something astonishing. A provincial family firm had moved from a Bristol shop to the center of global tobacco capitalism in little more than a century. But empires are not only measured by balance sheets. They are measured by the worlds they make at street level. And nowhere was that more visible than at the factory gates. Industrial power on its own does not create intimacy. It creates output. To enter a nation's bloodstream, output has to be wrapped in symbols ordinary people recognize and carry. Wills understood packaging earlier and more intelligently than many of its competitors. It sold not just cigarettes but identity. Packets were designed to signal class, mood, aspiration, and reliability. Some brands spoke to clerks and shopkeepers, some to laborers, some to men who wanted a premium blend and the performance of distinction that came with it. Tobacco branding in this period was not yet a secondary matter. It was the point at which a huge industrial process was translated into personal habit. Wills also became famous for cigarette cards. At first they functioned as stiffeners inside packs, but they quickly became something bigger. Collectibles, miniature educational objects, fragments of fantasy, empire, sport, military history, film, animals, uniforms, geography, aviation, flags. In millions of British homes, tobacco entered childhood indirectly through the cards even when the smoking itself belonged to adults. Children sorted them, swapped them, completed sets, and learned the world through the marketing byproducts of a cigarette company. That detail sounds small until you realize what it meant. Wills was not merely selling nicotine. It was colonizing attention. The cigarette card matters because it reveals how industrial capitalism extends beyond the commodity into memory. A family might not preserve a tobacco packet, but they might preserve an album, A child might not remember the brand blend, but they remember the cards. The company's cultural footprint therefore exceeded the act of smoking itself. It helped furnish visual culture. The same was true abroad. Will's was not simply a Bristol success story. It was part of an imperial and then international tobacco order. Family members and associated businesses reached into overseas leaf supply and brand expansion. British American Tobacco, formed after the settlement with Duke, gave the wider combine a vehicle for global market division and export. The Will's name therefore belonged not just to a city but to a broader system in which tobacco, empire, shipping, finance, and colonial markets reinforced one another. There is an uncomfortable precision to this. The cigarette became one of the portable consumer goods of empire because it was easy to distribute, easy to habit form, easy to brand, and easy to insert into military and civilian routine. Will's helped industrialize that portability. Its packets moved through corner shops, barracks, docklands, and colonial circuits. The cigarette was one of modernity's perfect little units. Cheap enough to repeat, small enough to carry, profitable enough to scale. And scale brought a strange kind of legitimacy. The more widely the cigarette circulated, the more normal it seemed. It became part of rationing culture, part of wartime morale, part of masculine sociability, part of breaks, waiting, train journeys, and after-meal rituals. Modern Britain built whole micro-ceremonies around tobacco. To light a cigarette was not simply to consume. It was to pause, to talk, to punctuate, to belong. Will's benefited from all of that and helped intensify it. If the company's factories were the iron lungs of the enterprise, branding was its nervous system. It carried the product into homes and imaginations. It made the company feel familiar even to people who would never see Bedminster. That is why the empire could seem so natural at its peak. A giant factory can still feel remote to many citizens. A packet in the hand does not. Will's built a bridge between enormous industrial systems and ordinary domestic life. It did so through names, colors, imagery, slogans, and collectibles. It taught people not merely what to smoke, but how to recognize themselves in what they smoked. This is another reason the later collapse hit with such cultural force. When a company has saturated everyday life for generations, its retreat feels larger than a commercial contraction. It feels like the withdrawal of a language. Britain would continue to smoke. Other companies would rise. Other brands would dominate segments. But the specific world in which Will's was a maker of packets, cards, habits, and identities had already become part of national memory before the corporation itself began to recede. And nowhere did that memory remain more concentrated than in the workers who actually made the thing. One reason cigarette firms became so deeply rooted in 20th century Britain is that the cigarette attached itself to the great experiences through which ordinary people understood the century. War, work, waiting, travel, boredom, stress, and relief. In wartime, cigarettes were small enough to issue, familiar enough to comfort, and addictive enough to feel necessary. They traveled in kit, in parcels, in canteens, in dugouts, and in letters home. A cigarette could mark a pause between bombardments, a brief return to routine inside catastrophe, a way to share companionship when language ran short. That is one reason tobacco companies gained something beyond customers from war. They gained emotional authority. Their products became bound to memory at moments when memory burned deepest. Woodbine was especially suited to that role because it was already a popular working cigarette before the First World War made it emblematic. The figure of Woodbine Willie, the chaplain Jeffrey Studdert Kennedy, only became nationally legible because the brand itself was already embedded in popular consciousness. He was not called Cigarette Willie. He was called Woodbine Willie, and everyone understood the reference immediately. That tells you how far the packet had traveled into public life. After war, the cigarette returned with the men who had smoked it. But it did not return as before. It came back freighted with association, service, endurance, masculinity, comradeship, grief, adulthood. Smoking in post-war Britain therefore carried meanings industrial marketing alone could never have purchased. The wars had naturalized the cigarette still further. Wills and Imperial did not create those meanings from nothing, but they benefited immensely from them. Brands that had become familiar in war now looked timeless in peace. They sat on pub counters, in shops, on buses, in coat pockets, in matchday crowds, in factory breaks, and at kitchen tables. To smoke was to participate in one of the most normalized habits in modern British life. And the habit was democratic in a very specific sense. It crossed class, though not equally. There were premium brands and cheaper brands, refined cigarettes and rougher reputations, but the act itself belonged almost everywhere. A manual worker and a barrister could both smoke. A soldier and a shopkeeper could both smoke. A princess could visit a cigarette factory, and nobody would think the connection grotesque. That breadth gave tobacco companies extraordinary protection. A business tied to all classes and all routines is harder to isolate morally. Advertising and sponsorship then reinforced the habit by making cigarettes part of mood rather than merely need. Cigarettes became linked to glamour, adventure, sport, leisure, and self-possession. The packet was never only a packet. It was a cue. It told you who you were, or at least who you might briefly feel like becoming. Industrial repetition met emotional fantasy. For Wills, this was the golden achievement of the whole enterprise. The company did not merely sell a manufactured object. It inserted a manufactured object into the emotional punctuation of national life. A cigarette at the end of a shift. A cigarette before the train. A cigarette after bad news. A cigarette in celebration. A cigarette in grief. Once a commodity reaches that level of habitual intimacy, it ceases to feel like a commodity at all. It feels like part of being modern. That is why the eventual reversal was so difficult, socially and psychologically. Public health did not have to defeat only an industry. It had to defeat a ritual order. And the ritual order had spatial consequences too. Because once smoking becomes nationally habitual, the places that produce cigarettes acquire a kind of hidden centrality. Most smokers never see the factories. Yet the factories become silent partners in millions of private acts. Bedminster and South Bristol therefore stood behind far more British life than most Britons would ever know. The people stripping leaf and running machines in Bristol were helping sustain habits in homes and streets they would never visit. This hidden centrality gave the Wills works their peculiar stature. The factory was local. The habit was national. The company became the bridge between them. It took neighborhood labor and converted it into countrywide routine. That is one reason closure felt, to many former workers, like more than an economic adjustment. They had not been producing something marginal. They had been producing one of the country's most familiar objects, an object so ordinary that the nation barely noticed the labor inside it until the labor disappeared. By the time health authorities, campaigners, and regulators began attacking smoking with sustained force, they were attacking not merely a dangerous product but one of the most embedded everyday rituals in Britain. The Wills factory therefore stood at the center of a historical contradiction. It manufactured a product that was both socially intimate and medically catastrophic. That contradiction could be postponed for decades. It could not be postponed forever. And when the national habit began to weaken, the local giant that had fed it discovered how exposed scale can become once intimacy breaks. To understand what Wills meant, You have to stop thinking first about directors and dividends and start thinking about mornings. A school leaver in South Bristol. 15 years old. Friday was your last day in class. Monday you walked to the factory. You put on green overalls and joined the stream heading toward East Street or Raleigh Road. The brick rose above the terraces. The overhead walkways crossed public roads. The works seemed to go on forever. It did not feel like entering a workplace. It felt like entering a separate jurisdiction. And before you got there, you smelled it. Former workers remembered the smell because you could not help remembering it. Heavy tobacco. Sweet and sour at once. Damp leaf. Warm dust. Steam. A smell that clung to clothes, hair, and skin. It traveled home. It entered drawers and curtains and the fabric of houses. In districts around the factories, tobacco smell became local atmosphere. It did for Bedminster what steel did for Sheffield or pottery for Stoke. It announced what the place was for. Inside, the labor was more complex than outside observers often understood. Tobacco processing involved softening, steaming, stripping, cutting, blending, rolling, packing, and movement between bonded warehouses and production lines. In some rooms humidity was deliberately high, oppressive enough to feel tropical. The work could be repetitive, but it was not mindless. Skilled workers understood leaf, speed, waste, and timing. Women, especially, played crucial roles in the labor process for decades, particularly in tasks linked to cigar and leaf preparation. The social hierarchy of the factory was rigid, but that did not prevent intense forms of solidarity. Office staff and factory labor were often kept apart culturally. Management carried itself as management. Yet on the shop floor people forged friendships that lasted decades. Songs, jokes, routines, rivalries, romances, and departmental identities created an internal society. Like every giant workplace, Wills generated not only wages but memory. That society was shaped by the family's paternalism. Some of it now reads as absurdly controlling. In earlier periods, female employees might be subject to moral scrutiny that extended beyond the work itself. One historical clause governing women cigar makers stated she should not contract matrimony during her term or engage in gaming. References from Sunday school could matter. The family's religious seriousness translated into oversight that today looks invasive and moralizing. But the same paternal structure also produced welfare measures that were genuinely advanced for their time. Wills became known for paid holidays, medical services, canteens, sickness schemes, recreation, sports facilities, pensions, and staff clubs long before such provisions became widely standardized by the state. In other words, the company was both controlling and generous. That is why former workers could remember it with both affection and ambivalence. Wills did not treat labor as a pure cost in the 19th century worst sense. It treated labor as a population to be managed. And managed at scale it certainly was. By the early 20th century, women made up a very large share of Imperial's workforce. The factories generated not just employment, but a rhythm of life. There were works magazines, sports clubs, savings clubs, outings, and a corporate culture that encouraged people to think of themselves as belonging to more than a payroll. Wills was not alone in this. Many large industrial employers cultivated versions of the company family, but few did it on such a visible scale in one city. That visibility matters because the Wills workforce was never anonymous. It was woven into South Bristol. Fathers in the bonds. Sisters on cigarettes. Cousins in other works. Husbands and wives meeting across departments. The company was not a distant employer imposed on a town from outside. It was part of family structure itself. That is one reason the later closures were experienced not merely as job losses, but as a form of social dislocation deeper than the redundancy notices could capture. When a factory dominates a district long enough, it ceases to be just where people work. It becomes part of how they know one another. Wills understood that power early, and it built on it. One reason the Wills story has outlived many other industrial stories is that it was not only a story of men, machines, and managers. It was also a story of women in enormous numbers. By the early 20th century, tobacco manufacturing within Imperial employed a heavily female workforce, and Bristol reflected that pattern. Women stripped leaf, prepared cigars, packed product, managed countless repetitive yet skilled tasks, and helped sustain the production rhythm on which the company's profitability depended. This matters because industrial memory is often narrated through male labor even where women were numerically central. Wills cannot honestly be told that way. The female workforce shaped household economies. A daughter's job at Wills could change what a family could afford. In districts where employment was dense and intergenerational, women's wages were not supplementary in the sentimental sense. They were structural. Rent, food, furnishings, savings, marriages, and kin networks all rested partly on that income. But Wills did not encounter women workers as free individuals in the modern sense. It encountered them through paternal assumptions about morality, respectability, and discipline. The company's rules, welfare provisions, and cultural expectations reflected an employer that wanted labor but also wanted order. Order in dress. Order in conduct. Order in sexuality. Order in leisure. That is why the recollections of former workers can sound so mixed. There is gratitude for the security and facilities. There is warmth toward friendships and routine. There is also an unmistakable awareness that management presumed an extraordinary right to supervise the edges of private life. This is the peculiar social form of paternal industry. It offers care and control at once. It gives paid holiday and expects gratitude. It gives medical assistance and claims moral authority. It builds clubs and regulates conduct. It can be experienced as humane when compared with harsher employers, and still remain fundamentally unequal. Yet to stop there would flatten the story. Wills' welfare provisions were not propaganda alone. They mattered materially. Long before the full development of the modern welfare state, company medicine, convalescent support, canteens, pensions, recreation, and holiday policies changed the texture of working life. Workers did not imagine these things abstractly. They felt them at moments of illness, fatigue, scarcity, and old age. The Works magazine, sports clubs, outings, choirs, library, cricket grounds, and association football team all contributed to the sense that Wills was not simply buying labor by the hour. It was assembling a moral community around work. A deeply unequal community, certainly. A managed community, yes. But a community nonetheless. That is why workers could later describe the company as family while knowing perfectly well it was not family. The phrase did not mean equality. It meant embeddedness. It meant the company was present at courtships, funerals, retirements, illnesses, and Saturdays. It meant your social world did not begin and end at the factory gate because the employer had already extended itself beyond the gate. What makes this especially significant in Bristol is that the company's civic philanthropy and its workplace paternalism reinforced one another. The same family culture that endowed buildings also funded welfare. The same seriousness that produced public gifts also produced private supervision. The Wills worldview held together because it believed hierarchy could be moral if the superior party behaved as steward rather than exploiter. Modern readers are free to doubt that proposition, and often should. But if we do not understand that the family believed it, the later transition to financial capitalism becomes harder to grasp. The old Wills order justified itself by saying, "We owe something to the workers and to the city." The later corporate order did not need to say that at all, which is why so many former workers remembered not merely the wages, but the feeling that the company once knew who they were. That feeling may have been paternalistic. It may have been selective. It may even have been ideological. But when it disappeared, the loss was real. And by then, the company had become so central to South Bristol that losing that relationship meant losing more than employment. It meant losing a local social grammar. By the 20th century, the Wills empire did not simply employ people in South Bristol. It organized the place. At its peak, over 13,000 people were directly employed in the tobacco trade in the Bedminster and Ashton areas. Contemporary assessments held that roughly 40% of the wages in South Bristol depended on tobacco. That number is worth pausing over because it explains why so much later memory sounds almost religious. This was not a large employer among many. It was the central economic structure of entire districts. If you removed tobacco, you did not reduce local prosperity. You altered the operating system. Shops depended on factory wages. Public houses depended on factory wages. Banks, transport, service trades, local routines, everything leaned on the spending power generated by the works. The built environment leaned on it too. Bonded warehouses at Cumberland Basin stored leaf. The red brick style of the works echoed through surrounding streets. Company-supported institutions became local landmarks. A fire brigade, libraries, clubs, athletic grounds, cricket facilities. Wills was both employer and patron. That scale also explains the strange mixture of pride and ordinariness in workers' recollections. To outsiders, this was a tobacco giant. To those inside it, it could be simply where your mother worked, where your brother got on, where your aunt spent 40 years, where your wages came from each Friday. Great industrial systems survive in memory not because people think of themselves as part of history, but because they think of themselves as part of routine. And then there were the brands, which carried the factory's influence far beyond Bristol. Woodbine remained one of the great British popular cigarettes, tied in memory to soldiers, workers, and the poor. In the First World War, the chaplain Geoffrey Studdert Kennedy became known as Woodbine Willie, because he gave cigarettes to soldiers at the front along with spiritual comfort. The nickname only worked because Woodbine was already universally legible. It had become a cultural shorthand. Then there was Embassy, first introduced before the First World War and spectacularly relaunched in 1962. Embassy brought Wills into post-war consumer culture with unusual force. It was not just a cigarette, it was a domestic rewards machine. Embassy coupons could be collected and exchanged for goods. In millions of homes, cigarette consumption became tied to aspiration in the form of catalogs, gifts, and kitchen equipment. Toasters, blankets, kettles. Household items transformed packets into points and smoking into a route, however irrational, toward material reward. The scheme was brilliant because it translated a harmful habit into the emotional language of provision. Smoking did not just buy a cigarette. It helped buy Christmas. It helped furnish the house. It turned daily consumption into accumulation. Children searched for discarded coupons. Adults counted them on tables. Embassy embedded itself in family memory because it entered family economics. At its height, Embassy became Britain's leading cigarette brand. It also became part of national spectacle through sponsorship. By the late 20th century, the Embassy name sat behind highly visible sporting events, including snooker. Tobacco advertising did not merely sell tobacco. It bought legitimacy by attaching itself to national leisure. This is the point at which the Wills story becomes difficult to narrate simply. The company's products were not only profitable, they were socially sticky. They became markers of adulthood, class, reward, masculinity, routine, and belonging. The factory mattered because it made wages. The product mattered because it made habits. That is why the subject mattered beyond the product itself. Tobacco did not remain confined to the packet. It entered architecture, philanthropy, sport, domestic life, and the emotional economy of ordinary households. A cigarette company became a city-shaping institution because cigarettes were never just cigarettes in industrial Britain. They were rituals. And rituals can survive evidence longer than reason expects. For decades, Wills and Imperial rode that fact upward. But by the middle of the 20th century, the summit had already begun to hide the cliff. There are moments in industrial history when a company appears most permanent just before permanence fails. For Wills and Imperial, the decades after the Second World War carried exactly that illusion. Britain still smoked heavily. Imperial remained dominant. The company was wealthy, famous, and deeply woven into national life. Royal visits still made sense. The factory still represented modern employment. The brand names were established. The workforces were vast. Whatever anxieties existed inside the boardrooms, the public image remained one of solidity. In 1950, Princess Elizabeth visited the Bedminster factory and was presented with cigarette cards for Prince Charles. The symbolism now feels almost surreal. But at the time it seemed natural enough. Tobacco was not yet morally quarantined in public life. It was respectable, taxable, familiar, and integrated into the country's routines. That confidence reached an almost tragic architectural expression in the Hartcliffe development. In the late 1960s and early 1970s, Imperial commissioned a giant new cigarette factory and headquarters on the southern edge of Bristol. The project drew on international modernist design and immense corporate ambition. The site, later associated with what became Lakeshore, was built with a scale and assurance that only a company convinced of its long future would attempt. It was described as having an 800-year design life. That phrase alone deserves its place in industrial folklore. An 800-year factory for cigarettes. Think about what that means. A company so certain of the endurance of its market that it built for centuries. Not years. Not decades. Centuries. The new works were vast, modern, highly serviced, integrated with restaurants, banking facilities, and all the amenities of a self-contained corporate world. It embodied not merely production but a philosophy, that tobacco manufacture belonged to the future and that Bristol would remain one of its capitals. Yet by the time the new site was being realized, the terms of the market had already begun to shift. Smoking prevalence was falling. Public health evidence was accumulating. Competitors were stronger in fast-growing product segments. Britain's entry into the European Economic Community would help produce a tax regime less favorable to the kinds of cigarettes on which Imperial had historically dominated. The company was building at scale just as the basis of its dominance was beginning to move under its feet. This is what makes the Hartcliffe story so poignant. The building was not foolish. It was rational on the assumptions of an earlier world. It became tragic because history withdrew those assumptions more quickly than the company adapted. And adaptation, when it came, was partial. Imperial diversified into food and drink businesses as if it understood that tobacco alone could no longer guarantee security. Yet diversification was never the emotional or organizational core of the company. Tobacco remained the heart. The cultural confidence remained tied to tobacco. The factories remained tobacco factories. The company still thought of itself, deep down, as a tobacco empire. What it did not fully appreciate was that the product had entered a new age. The cigarette had once been a symbol of progress, routine, and mass consumption. It was about to become evidence. In 1950, Richard Dahl and Austin Bradford Hill published research in the British medical journal linking smoking to lung cancer. This was not the first suspicion, but it was one of the defining turning points. Epidemiology began to make visible what anecdote, denial, and habit had concealed. Heavy smoking carried grave risk. For a society in which smoking was normal, this was difficult information to absorb. In post-war Britain, cigarettes were not fringe products. They were common among men, common among women, common in workplaces, common in public life, common in domestic life. They were sold openly, advertised widely, and taxed profitably. To say that the ordinary cigarette was a major vector of illness was to say that ordinary life itself had been built around a dangerous fiction. Industry response in Britain tended to be quieter than the more brazen denial often associated with some American firms. That did not mean it was morally superior. It meant it was institutionally smoother. Reassurance, modification, filters, lower tar, managed relationships with government. A tone of responsibility without a surrender of the market. Then, in 1962, the Royal College of Physicians published Smoking and Health. This report carried enormous force because it translated specialist evidence into public authority. It told a broad audience, in unmistakable terms, that smoking was killing people. It urged government intervention and public action. It helped change not just knowledge but mood. That shift matters. Industries can survive bad facts for a long time if the surrounding culture does not emotionally reorganize around them. Once the culture begins to reorganize, the facts start acquiring political and commercial consequences. Television cigarette advertising was later banned. Health warnings appeared on packets. Anti-smoking campaigning became more organized. Gradually, smoking ceased to be merely normal and became contested. Importantly, the decline in smoking did not happen evenly across class. Better educated and more affluent groups often quit sooner. Smoking increasingly concentrated among poorer and more manual communities, which meant the social groups most tied historically to tobacco labor and tobacco consumption were often the groups carrying the burden longest. That sharpened the tragedy. The product which had financed South Bristol and defined its routine was also helping damage the health of the people most dependent on it. The company could continue to make money, but the moral ground was changing under its feet. Meanwhile, another threat emerged from a less theatrical source than public health: product format and tax structure. When Britain entered the EEC, tobacco taxation shifted in ways that made longer, king-size cigarettes more commercially advantageous. This mattered because Imperial had been especially strong in standard-size products. Rivals were better positioned in the growing king-size segment. As consumer preference shifted, Imperial's market leadership came under real strain. What years of health evidence had begun, tax design and competitive product mix accelerated. Market share declined. Smoking rates declined. The great cigarette machine was still producing, but the certainties that had sustained it were eroding from several directions at once. A company can survive one structural pressure. It is much harder to survive several at once when each one undermines a different part of your old strength. Wills had helped create a mass cigarette age. It now had to live through the unmaking of that age. And when the reckoning came in corporate form, it came from men who did not share the old family mythology at all. By the time the public health case against smoking had become impossible to ignore, Imperial, and the Will's inheritance still possessed one great advantage: habit. Habit can delay reckoning for a very long time. People do not instantly stop doing what they have woven into daily ritual, especially when the ritual is socially reinforced and chemically addictive. But delay is not immunity. The first long-term problem was cultural. Smoking, once associated with sophistication, adulthood, solidarity, and reward, began to accumulate a new symbolism: risk, illness, stigma, regulation. That change was uneven, but it was real. Once a habit starts losing prestige, the market around it becomes more fragile even before total consumption collapses. The second problem was demographic. The generations coming of age in the later 20th century were not entering the cigarette market under the same assumptions as their parents and grandparents. Smoking was still common, but it was no longer innocent. Every warning, every campaign, every school lesson, every policy change made recruitment into the habit more difficult. The third problem was competitive. Imperial had not been defeated simply by the discovery that smoking was dangerous. It was also challenged by rival firms better placed in the changing shape of the cigarette market. Product size, design, branding, and taxation began interacting in ways that made Imperial's traditional strengths less secure. The company had dominated standard-size products. The market increasingly moved toward king size. Once tax treatment favored those formats, Imperial's old leadership became a weakness. This is one of the less glamorous but most important truths in the Will's decline. Great industrial firms are not always destroyed by dramatic external moral shocks. Often they are wounded by a combination of moral pressure and technical market shifts. Health evidence changed the long future of smoking. Tax design and consumer preference changed the nearer competitive landscape. By the 1970s and 1980s, these forces were converging. Smoking rates in Britain were falling. The product was under political pressure. Imperial's home market share was slipping, and the company's response, diversification, was real but incomplete. Buying into foods and other sectors suggested management understood that tobacco was becoming a narrower foundation. But diversification also implied an admission: the old self-confidence was gone. Even then, the company could still seem impregnable from the outside. Large companies often do. Their decline begins internally, in ratios, portfolios, tax burdens, and strategic unease, long before the public sees shuttered gates. This is why Hartcliffe's confidence was so deceptive. The building announced certainty at the precise moment certainty was becoming impossible. There is also a deeper irony here. For more than a century, Will's and then Imperial had benefited from being ahead of structural change. They saw the machine early. They saw branding early. They saw consolidation early. They understood scale before others did. In decline, the company was suddenly on the wrong side of structural change. It was now the incumbent defending an old market logic while others adapted faster. And incumbents rarely feel their own slowness clearly in real time. They confuse size with safety. They believe the market will continue to organize itself around the forms in which they became powerful. That illusion is strongest in companies that have once been national institutions. Their very success teaches them the wrong lesson. It teaches them to trust continuity. But continuity is what late 20th century capitalism increasingly refused to offer. By the time the takeover men arrived, much of the groundwork for dismantling had already been laid by history itself. Smoking was a contested product. The market was changing. Factories built for one era were now expensive assets in another. The old civic bargain between company and city had become, from a purely financial standpoint, irrational. And when a thing becomes irrational in finance, someone eventually comes to monetize the correction. The Wills family had long since ceased to define the company in the old way. Their name remained powerful. Their buildings remained. Their legacy remained in Bristol's stone and institutions. But the family-controlled moral universe of 19th-century paternalism was gone. The company had become a modern corporation, and modern corporations attract modern predators. In the mid-1980s, that predator arrived in the form of Hanson. Lord Hanson's takeover of Imperial Group in 1986 has entered local memory in Bristol almost as a synonym for asset stripping. That phrase can sometimes be used lazily. Here it captures something real. Hanson was not interested in preserving a civic industrial inheritance. It was interested in value extraction. Imperial by then was not only tobacco. Over years it had diversified into businesses such as food and brewing. Those businesses made strategic sense as a hedge against tobacco's uncertain future. Hanson sold many of them off. Courage, Golden Wonder, other assets. The point was not to build a better long-term industrial ecology. The point was to realize value quickly. In one sense, Hanson's logic was brutally rational. If parts of the conglomerate were worth more sold separately, sell them. If the future lay in concentrating on the core, concentrate. If older factories were inefficient, close them. Rationality, however, depends on what counts in the equation. For South Bristol, the human consequences were not incidental. They were the story. Factory closures followed. The old Bedminster structures were cut back or demolished, though some facades survived. Operations were consolidated. The Wills and player sales forces merged. The separate operational identity of W.D. and H.O. Wills effectively disappeared into a harder corporate logic. In 1988, Imperial withdrew the Wills name from most UK products, retaining it only on a few residual brands such as Woodbine and Capstan Full Strength. That symbolic erasure mattered. Jobs matter more than branding, obviously. But names also carry continuity. For over 2 centuries, Wills had been an identity in Bristol, not merely a label on packets. When the name was stripped back, something more than a marketing architecture vanished. A local industrial lineage lost public form. Then the great Hartcliffe dream failed too. The factory built with an imagined life of centuries ceased cigarette production after only a short existence. The contrast is so sharp it almost reads like satire. An 800-year building. 16 years of cigarette making. Industrial optimism turned into an epitaph. Between the mid-1980s and early 1990s, the speed of the contraction was astonishing. In roughly the time it takes to raise a child, a world of work built over generations was dismantled. Employment collapsed. Sites fell silent. Redundancies were offered. Entire routines disappeared. People who had expected to retire from the company found themselves recast into a service economy, precarious work, or early exit. The old Wills system had controlled workers too much. That is true. But it had also treated them as part of the enterprise's moral landscape. The Hanson era, by contrast, made visible a colder principle: labor as an adjustable variable. Once that principle was accepted, place no longer had a deep claim. History no longer had a deep claim. If production was cheaper elsewhere, it would move. This was not unique to tobacco. It was part of a broader late 20th century industrial story across Britain and Europe. But in Bristol the effect felt especially sharp because Wills had been so rooted. Steel towns and mining towns knew this pain in their own ways. Bedminster learned it through tobacco. And the story was not over. because after Bristol came the longer relocation of manufacturing itself, away from the city, away from England, and eventually away from the national identity that had built the company. Once industrial retreat begins, it often proceeds in stages that can be misread as temporary. One site closes. Another remains. One product moves. Another survives. Workers tell themselves the last remnant will hold because it always has before. Cities learn to live in the tents of reduction. For Bristol, the last remnant was not the vast old Bedminster complex and not the grand Hartcliffe vision. It was a smaller cigar factory on Winterstoke Road, a much humbler final chapter than the city's tobacco history deserved. By then, the age of giant works employing thousands had already passed. What remained was residue. But residues matter, because they are where continuity hides. When Imperial announced more restructuring and job cuts in the late 2000s, the final tobacco manufacturing presence in Bristol was effectively living on borrowed time. Around 2010, that last site closed. And with that closure, the city's continuous tobacco-making history, stretching back to the 18th century, came to an end. That ending was almost indecently unceremonious. No grand public rite. No civic goodbye equal to the scale of what had existed. Just announcements, statements, gates, and silence. This too is part of late industrial history. Great manufacturing systems often end not with ceremony but with procedure. And then the final national line broke. In 2014, Imperial announced the closure of the Nottingham Horizon factory, the last cigarette manufacturing site in England. Production would move largely to Poland. Official language described the decision as necessary for competitiveness and long-term business security. Union language described it differently. Both descriptions revealed something true. The company was acting according to shareholder logic. Workers were paying the price. The significance of the move went beyond one city. England, whose industrial modernity had once been so bound up with tobacco consumption, no longer made its own cigarettes at scale under the company that had once dominated the market. The registered office remained in Bristol. The corporate continuity remained on paper. Manufacturing did not. That distinction between headquarters and making is central to the afterlife of wills. A company can remain in a city while the labor that once justified its presence has vanished. Offices replace works. Management replaces manufacture. Strategy replaces smell. The people in the building are still employed, but they are not the people who once made the district what it was. And so the will story became one of those distinctly modern tragedies in which the institution survives, the profit survives, the brand portfolio survives, the legal entity survives, even the prestige survives, but the industrial community that gave the institution its social meaning does not. This is why nostalgia for wills is always unstable. It is not nostalgia for tobacco alone. It is nostalgia for employment density, for neighborhood purpose, for institutional weight, for the old knowledge that a place made something. But it cannot be pure nostalgia because the product itself damaged health on an enormous scale. To miss the factory world is not necessarily to miss the cigarettes. What people mourn, often, is the social order around the making. The city had lost the work. Now it had to decide what to do with the shells. Industrial decline leaves three things behind: land, structures, and memory. Developers can work with the first two. The third is harder. The Hartcliffe site became a lesson in this. Much of the great factory complex was demolished. The wider area became Imperial Park, a retail landscape of shops and parking rather than manufacturing and shifts. Yet the headquarters building survived, was listed, and eventually re-emerged as Lakeshore, a residential development. The old corporate architecture of tobacco modernism became apartments. Balconies replaced boardrooms. Domestic calm replaced industrial ambition. In Bedminster, the story was similar but more layered. Parts of the old East Street works gave way to retail and housing. One major redevelopment marketed the converted buildings through the very language of heritage. Old names returned as residential brands. The tobacco past became aesthetic capital. What had once been an argument for industrial permanence became a selling point for urban desirability. This is not unusual. Across post-industrial Britain, warehouses become lofts, mills become galleries, docks become leisure districts. But in Bristol, the repurposing of Will's space carries a special irony because the developments frequently preserve the facades and names while omitting the labor culture that gave the meaning. Heritage remains. Workers fade. One of the most remarkable survivals is the tobacco factory on Raleigh Road, where a former industrial building became a cultural venue under the guidance of architect George Ferguson. The transformation is significant because it did not merely market the shell. It tried, in a different register, to return public life to the site. Theater, market, cafe, offices, performance. Culture replaced manufacturing, but not in a way that erased collective use entirely. Even so, the broader pattern remains clear. Industrial land in a valuable city eventually becomes something else. Apartments, retail, leisure, professional space. Regeneration can be real. North Street today is lively. Bedminster has recovered forms of energy. But recovery should not be confused with continuity. The people, rhythms, and wage structures that once defined the district are not restored by cafes or property brochures. They are replaced. And replacement has its own moral language. The old developments speak of city living, heritage, design, lifestyle. These words are not false. They simply belong to a different class era than the one that built the original factories. What had been a dense world of working-class labor becomes a premium narrative of authenticity for a newer urban market. That is what makes the Wills buildings so charged. They are not ruins in the romantic sense. They are active, useful, monetized, admired. But their usefulness now rests partly on forgetting what once happened inside them. People like the brick. People like the scale. People like the story of reinvention. What is much harder to hold in view is the full weight of the labor that produced both the wealth and the architecture in the first place. This is why archives matter. Bristol Archives holds thousands of Wills-related items. Shed preserves tobacco collections, packaging, portraits, and material culture. Oral history projects such as Bedminster's Tobacco Women recorded the memories of former workers precisely because those memories were at risk of being flattened into decorative heritage. The archive pushes back against the marketing brochure. It insists that behind the facade there were shifts, lungs, bodies, jokes, marriages, dust, routine, fatigue, skill, and dependence. A city can keep the building and lose the people twice. First economically, then narratively. Bristol came dangerously close to doing exactly that. One of the sharpest observations made by researchers and oral historians working on Bristol's tobacco past is that many former workers felt themselves to have been airbrushed out of the city's memory. Airbrushed is the right word. Not forgotten by accident. Smoothed away. Cleaned up. That sense of erasure comes from a very specific modern discomfort. Contemporary cities often want the atmosphere of their industrial past without the social conflict, bodily harm, and class density that actually constituted it. They like brick, chimneys, and repurposed names. They are less sure what to do with dependence on nicotine, exploitative global supply chains, paternal labor regimes, or communities left poorer when the plants closed. The Wills story is hard to remember cleanly because it resists moral simplification. It is not a story in which the founders were simply villains. They built institutions that still enrich Bristol. They appear to have taken obligations to their city seriously in ways many modern executives do not. Their company pioneered welfare provisions for workers that were, in context, advanced. They helped define a civic culture of giving. But it is also not a story in which industrial paternalism deserves uncomplicated admiration. The product harmed public health on a monumental scale. The earlier tobacco economy benefited from enslaved labor in the Atlantic world. The company's treatment of workers could be benevolent and intrusive at once. And when the corporate culture changed, the very workforce whose loyalty had helped sustain the enterprise discovered how little permanence loyalty guaranteed under financial capitalism. That combination is exactly why the story matters. A simpler story can be shelved quickly. A morally mixed one keeps pressing. The Wills Memorial Building still stands over Bristol, severe and beautiful, a Gothic monument financed by tobacco wealth. The University of Bristol still bears the imprint of Wills' philanthropy. The City Museum still carries the trace of the family's giving. Imperial Brands still keeps its registered office in Bristol. On paper, the inheritance is visible everywhere. Yet no cigarettes are manufactured in Bristol now. No giant stream of green-overalled workers crosses the roads. No bonded warehouses define the district's pulse. No smell of leaf hangs permanently in the streets. No branch bank prepares for thousands of wage packets. The institutional skeleton remains. The industrial body is gone. That absence has shape. You can feel it in redevelopment language. You can feel it in the gap between the pride with which certain buildings are preserved and the relative thinness with which the workers themselves are publicly commemorated. You can feel it in the fact that a city may eagerly consume the style of industrial heritage while remaining unsure how to honor the labor history underneath it. There is a temptation, especially in documentaries about vanished industry, to turn closure into pure elegy. But that would be dishonest here. The decline of smoking is not a loss to be mourned in itself. Fewer cigarettes, fewer addicts, fewer smoking deaths, that is plainly a public good. The moral challenge is different. It is to recognize that a harmful product can nonetheless be embedded inside forms of solidarity, belonging, institutional generosity, and local identity. History often works that way. Good social worlds are sometimes built around bad commodities. Wills mattered far beyond tobacco because it organized lives far beyond tobacco. It taught generations where work was. It financed public buildings. It gave South Bristol a center of gravity. It helped ordinary families imagine stability. Then, when the old economy turned, it left behind a lesson equally large. That communities built around one giant employer are strong until the logic that sustains the employer changes. Then the strength becomes exposure. There is one final twist in the Wills story, and it belongs to the present. The company did not vanish. It changed name, structure, geography, and tone. Imperial Tobacco became Imperial Brands. The word tobacco itself grew awkward enough to be dropped from the main corporate identity. The registered office remained in Bristol. Annual reports continued. Executives continued. Investors continued. The institution survived as a modern multinational with products, assets, strategies, and supply chains extending far beyond the city that gave it its original shape. On paper, that can look like continuity. But continuity is a deceptive word here. What remains in Bristol now is administration, governance, corporate memory, and legal identity. What is gone is the deep link between the company and the surrounding laboring population. The old relationship between district and employer has been severed. The corporation still bears the historical trace of Wills. The city no longer experiences it as Wills was once experienced. This separation between headquarters and production is one of the defining features of contemporary capitalism. Firms can preserve high-value strategic functions in one place while relocating manufacturing wherever labor, tax, logistics, and regulation make it cheapest. From a managerial point of view, this is efficiency. From the perspective of industrial history, it is an uncoupling of company from community. The old Wills empire had many contradictions, but one thing it could not be accused of was placelessness. Its owners lived in or near the city. Their philanthropy changed the city. Their factories defined districts of the city. Their reputation depended on the city. The modern successor company operates in a different moral geography altogether. Bristol is where the paperwork remains anchored, not where the cigarettes are made. That is why the final silence feels oddly shaped. The buildings remain in one form or another. The legal entity remains. The local prestige of the old family survives in landmarks. Yet the industrial heart has been extracted. The result is a city still visibly marked by a business that no longer exists there in its old social form. To stand in Bristol today is therefore to stand inside a layered contradiction. The Wills Memorial Building remains one of the city's great visual certainties. University life continues under a tower paid for by tobacco wealth. Residential schemes market industrial authenticity generated by generations of labor. Cultural venues thrive in repurposed factory shells. Meanwhile, the company that grew from all this still sits on the stock market as a modern international business whose manufacturing geography lies elsewhere. A person could pass through the city, admire the architecture, perhaps even know the Wills name, and never quite understand that thousands once lived according to the shift pattern of that company. That is what airbrushing looks like in real urban life. The trace survives. The explanation dissolves. And yet complete erasure has not happened. Former workers spoke. Researchers recorded. Archives persisted. Local memory resisted flattening. The reason this story can still be told in full is that the city did not entirely surrender the human record to the property brochure or the corporate timeline. That matters because history is not just what happened. It is what later generations choose to keep visible. If Bristol chooses to keep only the handsome brick, it keeps a lie of omission. If it keeps only the public health indictment, it keeps another incomplete truth. If it keeps only the philanthropy, it turns power into benevolence. If it keeps only the collapse, it forgets the force and organization that once made the city run. The Wills story needs all of it: the product and the wages, the machine and the women, the chapel morality and the Atlantic trade, the university tower and the hospital wards full of smoking-related disease, the pride and the harm, the gift and the bill. That is why, long after the last cigarette was made in Bristol, the Wills factory still matters. Because it remains one of the clearest ways to understand how Britain built, justified, profited from, and then morally revised its industrial age. So what was lost when Wills was lost? Not simply a company. Companies come and go. Not simply a product. The product deserved to lose its cultural innocence. What was lost was a complete local system of meaning. A first job waiting behind the same gate your father knew, at a district whose working day had a common rhythm, a set of buildings that were not decorative but necessary, an employer that, for all its paternalism and contradiction, understood itself to be answerable to a city, a sense that making something, even something harmful, still bound thousands of people into a shared practical world. Henry Overton Wills arrived in Bristol in 1786 with a small business and the habits of a dissenting tradesman. From that beginning emerged a tobacco empire that helped build modern Bristol. It left the city richer, marked, compromised, employed, and dependent. It gave Bristol some of its proudest institutions and some of its most difficult inheritances. It connected domestic routine to global trade, civic philanthropy to cigarette profit, public grandeur to private addiction. Then, when the age changed, the company changed faster than the city could. Factories closed, brands were rationalized, production moved, the old names were retained where useful and dropped where not, and the places where thousands had worked were gradually translated into a different urban language. You can still read the old language if you know where to look, in the facades, in the archives, in the oral histories, in the names stamped across Bristol, in the workers' recollections of smell, heat, wages, and friendships, in the awkward truth that a city can be profoundly shaped by an industry it later wants to morally distance itself from. That is why the Wills story endures. Because it is not just the story of tobacco, it is the story of how Britain built industrial power, how cities were made dependent on single employers, how wealth turned into architecture and philanthropy, how evidence and regulation changed the fate of mass habits, how financial logic can dismantle a local world without ever sounding irrational, and how, long after the machines are gone, a place can remain full of structures that make no sense until you remember the workers who gave them life. Inside the Wills factory, cigarettes were made by the billion. But what the factory really produced was a social world. That was the true empire, and that is what Bristol lost. If stories like this matter to you, subscribe. There are more vanished factories, more forgotten empires, and more places still living inside what industry left behind.